so we're going to see some of his quotes today. One of them is, "The gospel comes to a multitude without money and without price, and the poorest of the poor are entitled to a front seat at the Church of the Nazarene." And so that's why today we're learning about poverty. We hear a lot in the news or see a lot of memes on Facebook that talk about, that give us perspectives about people in poverty that are not accurate. And a lot of times in the church, because we sort of swim in the water of our culture, we have a hard time sometimes sorting out what these false cultural perspectives are and what is actually true. A lot of times we're persuaded by a political party. So I've been looking for some good definitions of poverty, and I told Ted yesterday, I have come really close. You can go to the next slide, Jim. This is something that I've come really close to, but I found it last night written down by somebody else. This says that poverty is the condition of a person who is deprived of the resources, means, choices, and power necessary to acquire and maintain a basic level of living standards and to facilitate integration and participation in society. I think that's probably one of the best definitions of poverty that I've ever heard, and I really like that. Incidentally, it came from Canada. So then the next slide is another one that talks about poverty is complex. It is more than a lack of sufficient income to provide for the basic necessities of nutritious food, safe and stable housing, access to health, paying for medications and dentists, and completion of education and readying for employment. Poverty impacts an individual's choices, opportunities, and hopes for a better future, all of which impact their physical and emotional being. So I thought that those definitions and that definition, and then also kind of a little further explanation about the impact of poverty, were important for us as we consider this information that I'm going to share today. So back in the 1960s, the federal government established what is called the Federal Poverty Guidelines, and they have not changed. You can go ahead to the next one. They have not changed the criteria by which they determine this, but every year the poverty line is adjusted by the cost of living, basically. So these are the poverty guidelines, federal poverty guidelines, but those apply to all of the states. So when you go to get assistance from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, they will use the federal poverty guideline to determine what kind of assistance you get. There's kind of a myth out there that the government is taking care of people and that there are some people who are living entirely on the government. There's no such thing as welfare, okay? There's some housing vouchers that a little tiny percentage of people who live below the poverty line get. There are food stamps. It's actually not called that. Is it called EBT, bridge card? It's a bridge card that gives food benefits. Cash assistance is almost non-existent. It is so difficult to get, and people who get it get maybe $200. And then you'd have to be like a single mom with a baby. And you only get it for a maximum, I think it's 3 years in your lifetime can you get cash assistance. And so this sort of drumbeat that you hear that, you know, there are millions living on welfare and we're going to work to pay for it is just not the truth. So the federal poverty guidelines determine how much money you're allowed to make, it honestly, as you come up to this line, your benefits get cut. So if you're getting food assistance, that's the one that actually you can be at 150% of poverty. But like Section 8 housing and Medicaid and those sorts of things, your benefits start to dwindle as you approach the poverty line. So this is not the bottom, this is the top. Does that make sense? You can make up to this much. So for a family of 4, it's $30,000. For a family of 3, $24,860. And some people will say, well, that's how much I make. We're going to talk in a little bit about it's not just about the money. It's also about some other assets that you might have. Like sometimes people will say, well, I only make $13,000 a year as a single person. So I'm below the poverty line. But you're living in your grandma's basement. So your housing, if we added on the value of your housing, you would be over the poverty line. Does that make sense? If you're not adding in all of the things, then you're not counting all of the assets that you have. So let's go on to the next slide. This slide, there's a lot of numbers on here, but this slide, there's a study called ALICE that the United Way and Rutgers University did together, because there's a group of people. So ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. So these are people who are just at what it takes to cover their basic living expenses. So, and if you look at this, this is absurd, okay? This is the 2021 numbers. And it says for 2 adults with 2 children, rent is $470. Listen, if you know where there are some units in Owosso that 2 adults with 2 children can live for $470, please tell me, because I've been looking for some families, and that is an absurd number. And then utilities, that's probably pretty fair. But if you have childcare, so that's like the third column from that side, that's like $1,244 a month, and that is a real cost if you've done it. Transportation, if you're talking about car plus insurance plus gasoline. We don't have public transportation in Shiawassee County. SATA isn't really public transportation. They start after first shift starts and they end before second shift ends. So you cannot use SATA to get to a job for the most part. And also they only promise to get you to some place within an hour of a start time. And it's really hard to explain to your boss that you were an hour late to work because your ride couldn't get there. So transportation, healthcare, technology, that's a new thing that just recently got added. But people who complain about people in poverty having phones, well, how will the school get a hold of you in case of emergency? How will you call to file for your benefits or call? You have to have a phone, okay? And nobody has landlines. And the government phones have like 300 minutes of time on them. The memes make it sound like everybody's got an iPhone 14, tax payments or tax credits, because there is earned income tax credit. So if you look, we saw that the federal poverty guideline for a family of 4 was $30,000. And depending on whether you have 2 working adults and how much you're paying for childcare, the cost to meet these basic expenses, if you're renting a house that costs $470, is $52,000 to $57,000 a year. So there's a group of people that live in that gap between the $30,000 poverty guideline and the cost of living. Now, if you told people that the cost of living for a family of 4 is $57,000 in Shiawassee County, they'd say, oh, that's not true. But is there a disputable number on that board? Is there something that doesn't belong there? In fact, we would all say that's modest, right? There's no savings, so if your furnace breaks, what are you going to do? Car breaks down, what are you going to do? There's nothing extra in that. So I haven't done the math on these numbers. I used to know how much it is. To make $52,000 a year, I think you have to be making something like $35 an hour. Is that about right? $26 an hour. So if one person is working at $26 an hour, or if 2 people are working full-time at $13 an hour, then you're just at the poverty line. And a lot of those jobs that pay $13 an hour don't hire for 40 hours. Walmart doesn't, those are very part-time and childcare. So let's go on to the next slide now. I just put this here to show you can look and compare. For a single adult, the cost of living would be $25,164, and the poverty line is $14,580. Generally, it's about 40 to 50% of what it actually costs to live is the poverty guideline, and the poverty guideline is what determines whether you get assistance or not. And if you're approaching the poverty line, your assistance starts to dwindle. Okay? Now, there's also a thing called sub-poverty, and I don't necessarily have the numbers for that. In my experience, people who are in sub-poverty are living on half the poverty line. And about 5% of people in Shiawassee County are in sub-poverty. About 16% live below the poverty line, and 41% live at ALICE or below. Okay? Let's go on to the next slide. So this shows all of Michigan, but Shiawassee County is pretty much in line with that. This says that 60% of households in Michigan are above household survival. And if you added all those together, so 24% are between the poverty line and the Alice line, 10% are above sub-poverty but in poverty, and then 6% are sub-poverty. So they live well below the poverty line. So, and while I'm going to mention this now while I'm there, I sometimes have people say to me, well, you know, people in America, they say they're poor, but they're not really poor because, I mean, they have refrigerators, right? Well, first of all, not everybody does. And if you compare that with international poverty, because they're comparing to like Haiti or Guatemala or someplace in Africa, Uganda or something, right? Those people are really poor. Well, I went to Guatemala on a mission trip a few years ago. Some of you might remember, about 7 years ago. And we arrived in the dark, so I couldn't see what was happening on the highway. But the next morning when we got up, I was just in total shock. So there's like 4 or 5 lanes of traffic, all moving at about 40 miles an hour. Large trucks, some of them kind of utility trucks with the sides kind of bowing out and full of fruit or whatever, and semi-trucks and cars, and then also mopeds. And mopeds with 5 people on them, a family of 5 on a moped. Dad is driving, mom is sitting on the back. She has a baby strapped onto her back. There's an older child standing on the back of the moped and a kid in between mom and dad, okay? Try that in America, right? You can't leave the hospital without a $200 car seat. If you haven't gone shopping for car seats recently, it's crazy, right? So how is a single mom with a baby going to be able to afford a $200 car seat? But she has to, or her baby will be taken away. That doesn't happen in Guatemala. So I get that people in Guatemala, also the other thing in Guatemala that was crazy was there's kind of no zoning, or, you know, you can go cut up a bunch of fruit and like all along, if it would be like driving along M21 out here, and all the way along are people with a little table trying to sell papayas or whatever to make some money. And, you know, we have disputes about whether you can have a yard sale and where you can put your signs and all that kind of stuff, because we have certain requirements, because we require people to have a middle-class lifestyle. If you don't have a stove, you know, it's not that people, I know people who live without electricity until CPS finds out about it, right? They'd be fine to live without electricity. Or all over the world, kids sleep in mats on the floor. But here, and I asked a CPS worker once, because I was working with a family trying to help them get their kids back, and I said, do you really require that they have a bed per child? And they said, well, we don't take kids away if they don't have that, but it's a requirement for them to get their kids back. Okay, so it's a requirement, right? Every child has to have their own bed. In other countries, you put 3 or 4 kids in a bed, or they're sleeping on a mat on the floor. So we have these a double standard of, it's easy. We say that it's easy to move from class to class here, which I argue that it is not. You know, some said to me recently, well, we don't have a caste system here. Well, we don't have a formal caste system, but yes, we do. So poverty, as we heard in that definition, is about more than just how much money you have. So there's some external assets that you count, like money and property, family members with education, family members with financial resources, having a support network, and having favorable political, legal, and economic climates. So I'm just talking about those a little bit. We've already talked about the money. If you have family members who own property, you may not know this, but that is an asset to you. It is, you know somebody who knows how to acquire property. There's knowledge that comes with all of these assets. If you have family members with education, you know somebody who knows what you have to do to get into college and how to navigate that. Plus, for people who live in poverty, they've never seen education work for anybody. You can try to go to college, you can try to get a degree, but unless you have role models that say, hey, I tried that, and then I got a job that paid me a living wage, instead what you usually see in poverty is that people will try to go to college and they don't have enough money to do it, and then they have student loans to pay, and they add that on top of all the other things that they already have to pay. So they tried to get ahead, they tried to play the game, and it didn't work for them. And so the other thing is often education is a burden, even elementary school. So kids in poverty get sent home because they have head lice, which I understand the health concern of that, but then you have to stop and think, what message does that send to the child about education? They don't feel like school is a place where they belong. School is a place for the nice kids who have the right clothes and are well put together. It's not a place for me. And so there's this disconnect. Education is an abstract kind of thing. Having family members with financial resources. So this is, Ted and I both grew up in houses that were, well, I think I was probably poorer than Ted, but my parents were like intentionally poor, but we had family members with resources. But our son, grew up and started making more money than his dad by the time he was 22. And he said, hey, I'm kind of getting a lot of money in the bank, and I don't know what to do to invest it. Ted and I have never had investments except like 401ks that work does for us, right? I don't know how to take a wad of money and invest it with anybody because I never had that kind of money. But there are families that know that. I meant to print out this cool little test, but it's not that people in poverty don't know anything. They know a different set of things than you know, just like you don't know how to live in wealth. The quiz I have is, could you survive in poverty? Could you survive in the middle class? Could you survive in wealth? If it's so easy to move from one socioeconomic class to another, then why aren't we all millionaires, right? Because I don't know how to be rich. I don't know how to function in the circles of people who have their own broker and their own lawyer. I went to a conference once that was a poverty training that was actually several days long. And one of the exercises they had us do was they had us all go out into a parking lot. It was a class of social workers and, mostly people with kind of middle class, whitish collar jobs. And they started reading off these life circumstances, like if you were ever evicted from your home, take 3 steps back. If your family had your a vacation property, take 3 steps forward. If, it was all these different life circumstances. And by the end, we ended up spread out across that parking lot. Some people were way out there ahead of me. I was in the back of the middle, which is exactly where I would expect that I would be. Middle class, but kind of struggling is how I grew up. These were like growing up questions. But there were people who were behind me. And when we got back inside and we were debriefing at our tables, the woman who was the farthest out said, I'm so embarrassed. She said, my family, I grew up in a gated community. We lived in the smallest house in the gated community, and my parents were always struggling to keep up with the neighbors, and I believed I grew up poor. I had no idea that other people had those life experiences. And so having family members that have life experiences that are different is an asset. You know people who know people. I hope Alex doesn't mind me using her as an example, but she's been saying, why is everything going so good for me now? And I'm like, because Alex grew up at Pleasant Valley. I think most of you know that. And I said, because now you have somebody who knows people, right? And that's one of the reasons I always say when we're going out to Pleasant Valley and it's Thursday dinner and maybe you don't have time to bake the brownies or make a salad and you only have time to stop in for a few minutes, is that it's the biggest gift that you can give to a person in poverty is to let them know you. Because suddenly they have a connection to something they don't have otherwise. Because most of the time, people who live in poverty, their family was also in poverty. We're going to talk about this in a minute. And they live, if you think about Owosso, most of the low-income housing is over in the southwest corner. All of the subsidized apartments are over there. The trailer parks are over there. And incidentally, none of the grocery stores, right? So everybody that lives over there has to find a way to get to grocery store. And if you don't have transportation, that's a trick. Which I'm doing this whole thing totally out of order, but that's okay. Which is why people will sometimes say, oh, I was at Shell Station and I saw somebody using their bridge card to buy beef jerky and Doritos and Mountain Dew. Well, if that's the place you can get to and you have children to feed, you probably are going to buy really expensive junk food, because how are you going to get to Meijer, right? Alex's mom used to ride her bike from Pleasant Valley to Walmart to work for like 5 years in the rain and the snow, until I found out about it, and then I started giving her rides. And at first she didn't want to trust that I would be reliable. She said, I have to get myself there. This is how I have to take care of my kids. And I totally get it, right? Until she was finally able to get a car, because she had a connection and a bridging resource that she could get. But if she had to go to Walmart to buy groceries, how are you going to bike home with groceries for 3 kids on your bike, right? There's another mom that lived at Pleasant Valley. She doesn't live there anymore. And she told me one day she was walking up Chipman Street, Morris Road, Chipman, kind of past where those apartments are, from Pleasant Valley, to go to Crossroads Market. I don't know if you guys have been to Crossroads Market, but you probably don't shop there. There's Crossroads, and then there was Herons. I don't even know if Herons is open, but that was like the closest place to go. And so she's walking to get groceries. She can't leave her kids at home. Middle-class people can leave their kids at home and not be worried if CPS is coming. I left my children home alone when they were 10 and 12 years old. Nobody was checking on me. Nobody considered me an abusive parent for that. But if you live in poverty, CPS is all over you all the time. So she couldn't leave her kids at home, so she's walking to the grocery store. And some lady passed her, turned around, and came back and yelled at her for walking on that street because it didn't have a sidewalk and it's not a safe place to walk. Didn't offer a ride, didn't ask where she was going. And this mom said to me, I have to teach my kids how to walk on this road, because they're going to have to know how to walk on the road safely to get their own groceries someday. Which was heartbreaking to me, but also because she doesn't believe that life is going to be different for her kids than it has been for her, right? But also, what a good mom. This is, in her world, this is how life goes. Don't all of us teach our kids how to navigate the world we know, right? Does Jack know a little bit about what happens at Foster, right? Making coffee. I mean, he knows about that world. He knows about what it looks like to run a business, because that's what we do with our kids, right? Does Abby know anything about how to manage ministries at a church? Yep, she does. She could do it without me, because that's what she's learned. And that's what this mom was doing, was teaching her kids how to function in the world that she's aware of. So these are external assets. And then there's internal assets. Next slide. One of them is language and literacy. So a child, I don't have the exact number in my head, but I'm going to take a guess. It's something like a child who is born to a family where everybody is working to survive all the time. There's not, I've had educators say to me, why don't the parents just sit down and read a book to them? Well, if you come walk around with me for a minute, first of all, some moms and dads can't read because education didn't connect for them. And life is chaotic. And it's not this nice little, I know all of our lives feel chaotic, but there's a way. Our lives are more linear, not circular, and I'm not going to include that whole teaching today about the difference between oral culture and print culture, but we have calendars that we say at 7 o'clock, I'm going to do this, at 9 o'clock, I'm going to do this, at 10 o'clock, I'm going to do this, and for the most part, that can happen because we don't have things flying at us all the time, right? I remember one of the families we worked with a long time ago got up in the morning and their toilet fell through the floor. Yesterday, we had a man come and put new cabinets in our trailer out at Pleasant Valley this weekend, and he came back and said, I've never worked on a trailer before, and I don't know if I want to because those walls are paper. Yep, they are. And so the toilet falls through the floor. Well, now what are you going to do? Go to work and leave the toilet? Some of us have the kind of jobs where we can say, I have a family emergency, I'll be there in a couple hours, and you have the resources to call a plumber to come fix it. What are you going to do if you don't have that, right? Toilet fell through the floor. Now we're in trouble. So, I don't know how I got off on that when I was talking about language and literacy. I was talking about not having time to sit down and read. So a child who is born into a family with poverty, I think the statistic is something like 5,000 different words by the time they start kindergarten, right? Most of the language is about survival. Their parent education level doesn't have a huge vocabulary, and it's all about what are we going to eat, where are we going to go, this broke, that broke. That's how it goes. A child who's born to a family where somebody has a doctorate, I don't know if it's like 500,000 or 1 million. I mean, it's just a ton of words that the child has heard before they start kindergarten. And that has made connections in the brain that when the child then sits down to learn how to read, it's a much easier thing for them than it is for the kid whose vocabulary is very limited. And also, I have witnessed this so many times, trying to get a helping person to engage, and a person with limited vocabulary, and also with a level of anger. And you know what? Anger and poverty is completely justified. Because if you are continually forced to make decisions about whether you're going to buy medicine, or whether you're going to buy food, or whether you're going to pay the rent, or whether you're going to pay the electricity, are we going to get evicted or get the power turned off? That's the constant, because I didn't bring my little puzzle that shows, but when you only make half of what it takes to survive, something has to give all the time. And so when that is the constant way that you've lived, then anger is like you go to ask for help and they're asking you for 5 documents and your left arm to get $200 of rental assistance. You might get a little angry, right? So I have witnessed this where somebody comes up and they're using like the word ain't a lot, or just kind of limited vocabulary, and helping people usually have about a master's degree, and they just turn it off. Like, this person is stupid, is kind of uneducated, I know more than them, and I'm not helping, right? And then I can walk up and ask for the same thing, and I'm heard, right? So language and literacy are internal assets. Those are things that cannot be taken away from us. That's what internal assets are. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about types of poverty here in a minute. This sense of self, of that things can get better for me, that I have hope, that I'm a person of value. One of the people who I've taken some training with around the issue of poverty grew up in generational poverty, and she said, everywhere we went, we had to talk to people through glass and a little speaker, and I wondered what was wrong with my parents that we couldn't talk to people face to face. We had this situation with a young man that was living at our house who was attending school at Lincoln High School, and he had tried to call to do an appointment over the phone to get, I think it was a bridge card, for food. And they said, we can't talk to you over the phone, we have to see you in person. So Ted went and picked him up from high school. Now he's supposed to be in school, right? School is important. But it's not so important that you should stay there and we could just do a phone interview, right? Got to get out of school, drive to DHHS, and his worker called him in the lobby and talked to him over the phone and never looked at him in person. Dehumanizing. You're not worth that much. I don't come out and shake your hand and invite you to come in and say, tell me what's going on. Which is one of the reasons we do things like the Tuesday dinners. It kind of turns into social work just about every week, but we are neighbors sharing a plate of food. You're not a case file, a number. I can't talk to you over the phone about this, but you can go over to that phone and I'll talk to you over that phone. I mean, what is that, right? It's ridiculous. Hope that the future will be better, knowledge that my current actions affect the future, and a sense of security of place and resources. Sometimes it looks like people in poverty don't take care of their things. When you get evicted and get locked out of your house and all your stuff gets put out at the curb and you don't have a way to pick it up and you had to let go of your stuff, after a while you learn to detach from your stuff. And you just don't take care of it because if you get too attached to your stuff, it could get taken away, right? So now we're going to talk about types of poverty. I'm going to skip this one right now because it doesn't apply very, very much to what we do. Immigrant poverty, we'll talk about that. So situational poverty. Situational poverty is when somebody has grown up pretty much with their basic needs met, and they attend school regularly, they've had health care and family vacations, they've been surrounded by people who are educated with living wage jobs, and as an adult, they have some sort of crisis. There's a health situation, there's a divorce, there's a house fire, they lost their job, got fired, whatever. And suddenly, the money is gone away, okay? The external assets are gone. And it's an embarrassing situation. This happened back in 2008 with the housing crisis, that people who had been middle class, leading organizations, I know somebody who was an executive director of a nonprofit who ended up in a bread line to get food from a food pantry. That's embarrassing because that's not where you've ever been before. It's situational poverty. But what has happened is you still have the connections, you still have the education, you still have the sense of self. You know that things were good once, and that gives you hope that things can be better again. And so often, these people are ones who don't recognize the advantages of growing up middle class, and they can be really harsh on people who live in generational poverty. Because they'll say, if I could pull myself up by my bootstraps, and this is also true sometimes of families who, like maybe there's been addiction in the family, and so one family unit really struggled, but they had aunts and uncles who owned businesses and who had other assets, and they don't realize what that gave them because their situation was terrible that they were in, but they have some assets that people who are in generational poverty don't have. So we'll go to the next one. Working class poverty, these are the people that we talked about that are the Alice people. They're living paycheck to paycheck, and the focus is on making it 2 weeks or through the month. And one of the things that I talk about is the more resources you have, the farther you can project yourself into the future. So I remember when we were trying to plan to go to summer camp with people from Pleasant Valley, and I'd say, hey, put it on your calendars for next July. I don't know if I can go. I can't commit to that. I don't know what's going to be happening, right? I don't know what's going to be coming at me. I might be evicted. I might be living someplace else. I don't know, have a job, lose a job. I don't know. But if you have resources, you can, book a cruise for 2 years from now and be pretty confident that you're going to go. You can start paying for your kids' college because you believe 18 years from now, my child's going to be able to go to school. You can project yourself into the future the more resources you have. If you're living in generational poverty, which is the one we're going to talk about next, you can go there. Generational poverty, you have a hard time projecting yourself to the end of today. And sometimes, helping professionals get frustrated that you can't get people to plan. I was with someone recently who was frustrated that somebody hadn't made plans for life insurance and just said, why can't they just save, plan ahead? You know you're going to die. Why don't you pay $20 a month for life insurance? Well, first of all, that wasn't in the budget. If we're living on half of the survival budget, I'm worried about staying alive today, not thinking about when I'm going to die in 30 years, right? There's not room in the budget for that. And I'm not planning ahead. I have to survive today. One of the analogies I've used about that is if you could imagine that you're running through a woods and a bear is chasing you, right? And you're just doing everything you can to stay ahead of the bear and not be eaten by the bear. And I, standing off to the side and know nothing of this race that you're in, just see you running through the woods and ask, hey, what do you want to cook for dinner? Right? Are you going to stop and have a conversation with me about the future? No, you're not, because you're trying to survive. You're trying not to be eaten by the bear. And so asking people who live in generational poverty to plan for the future, I've early on asked some people, what would you like to do? eat, you know, pay my rent. That's what I'd like to do. Because the idea of a job or career, and the other thing I'll say is most people, even in working class poverty, but most middle class people especially, we have jobs where we feel good about what we do, and people say for the most part that we're doing a good job. You know, we get some props for it. It makes us feel productive. We're not like working for $11 or $12 an hour in a 100-degree factory. And getting docked points if we're late because our car wouldn't start that morning, and fired if we had to leave because our kid was sick, right? So what I think of, meaning of words belong inside of people. What I think of when I think of job is not the same thing that people in poverty think of when they think of job. They think, I'm going to go do that thing for 40 hours a week, and I still won't be able to pay my rent, and so I'm going to have to hustle when I get home to figure out how I'm going to collect pop bottles or beg, borrow, and steal, or when is St. Vincent de Paul open so I can go get $200 from them. Maybe I should just quit the 40-hour-a-week job, take something that is less so I have more time to hustle, right? So people in generational poverty typically they don't have people in their family who have owned property. They don't know anybody who's benefited from education or moved up or was respected at a job. They're often highly mobile, moving frequently to look for work, and they have high family illiteracy often, and focus is on making it through the day. The question, you know, I've had some frustrating conversations in the last few weeks when people say something like, we can't make it too easy on people in poverty or they'll want to stay there. Wow, who chose that? Because if there was a moment before I was born that I was supposed to choose what line I got in, I would have gotten in rich. I got in the middle class line, right? Oopsie, chose the wrong line. Poverty is not a choice. And in fact, we often look at people in poverty and say, well, if they spent their money like this, if they did like that, we're evaluating their choices when, in fact, if we were in the same set of circumstances, we would make the same choices. One of the things that is I've had donors, and there's a place in town that gives away free things, and they always say, you can't sell the things that we're giving away. Well, listen, if I'm trying to make my rent, I don't need a crystal cookie sheet or cookie tray, right? I don't need some fancy lamp. I need to pay the rent. So if you give me a free lamp, selling it, it's a currency I can use, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Like, I would do the same. If I couldn't make my mortgage or my rent, I'd be looking for some things to sell to make it, right? And so those kinds of, it just like, I get it. I've had donors get really mad. Well, gave them that couch and they just sold it. Yeah, because there's no point having a couch if you don't have a house to put it in. What are you going to do, sit on the curb in your couch? Of course they sold it for whatever they could get it for so they can make the rent. Got to make up that huge gap. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I think we've pretty much already talked about this, but in generational poverty, the outlook is that life happens to me and I don't have any control over it. In situational poverty, I pulled myself out. If I did it, anybody can. It's about choices. We didn't talk about immigrant poverty, but working class poverty, I have some control over my life, but not very much. In working class poverty, you might have zero money today, but you can project yourself to Friday when it's payday. Okay, I get paid Friday, right? But if you don't have anything, you can't project yourself into the future at all. All you're worried about is, what will we eat next? Let's go to the next slide. So these are just, I put some of these memes. These are things that you see, these kinds of things, like people will say, no job and job. Well, first of all, it's just totally inaccurate. But when people get their bridge card, usually a bridge card is about, at max, 60% of whatever that cost of living number was for food. So it's just gets you through about half the month. So we're going to be going to pantries by the end of the month. And what do you get at pantries? You get all kinds of canned food, off-brand things. You get a lot of pasta. And so the day the bridge card comes, also at pantries, you sometimes get your cereal in a Ziploc bag. And, it's an off-brand, which is fine. It doesn't have to be brand name stuff. I know the idea is to survive. But I think it's a human nature sort of thing that if we're going to be eating like that for the last couple of weeks, then when the bridge card comes, we're going to go get some good stuff, right? I mean, honestly, it doesn't matter if I have to go to the pantries for 10 days or 14 days. I'm going to go ahead and buy some good stuff. And people stock up, right? And so these are the things that really start to ingrain in people's brains and makes it more and more difficult for people in poverty because they think this stuff is true. Or they judge a decision that somebody has made when people are rational. I mean, if you're not, there are some people who are irrational. But for the most part, most human beings are doing the best they can in the situations they're in. And we have to assume that if we were in that situation, we would probably do the same thing. If they're not doing what we're doing, it's probably because their circumstances are different than ours. And that other one, too. I hid them under your work boots. 67% of people who live below the poverty line are working 1.7 jobs, I think it is. Because if you're only making $10, $11, $12 an hour, even to get anywhere near the poverty line, you have to have a couple different jobs. And you're still not at poverty, and you still have to figure out how to get there and who's going to watch the kids and all of that stuff. So let's go to the next one. I think I've talked about most of these, so I'm going to skip this. So I wish I had written down all the references when I did this, but I went once and looked up Bible verses about people in poverty. Someday I'll go back and look up the messages. Because this is not the message, I think, that typically we find at church. I see so many churches think that poverty is a moral issue. That they're poor because they drink, or they take drugs, or they have too many babies by too many men. Have you looked at Hollywood, right? If that's the stuff that makes you poor, why is everybody in Hollywood rich, right? That's not what makes people poor. What makes people poor is lack of access to education, health care, living wage jobs, and affordable housing. That's what makes people poor, okay? So this is what the sort of a summary of what I found when I looked in Scripture about the poor. The right way to say that is people experiencing poverty, but if you're going to look up the Bible verses, it's probably going to say, or under-resourced people. Try to use the people part of the word before you use the definition. So people experiencing poverty reminds us that they're people and not the poor, which is kind of an it thing, right? Or a person... My daughter is constantly correcting me. He has autism, or he's an autistic boy. Don't say that. He's a boy with autism. It just puts the person first. But anyway, this is what Scripture actually has to say for people who are in poverty. And Jesus said he came to preach good news for the poor. There's a place where I am safe and protected. There's a voice that speaks up for me, defends me, and advocates for me. My concerns are heard. I receive provision without shame. My struggle is acknowledged. I am remembered and not overlooked. I will be rescued from those who oppress or rob me. I am included and honored in the kingdom of God. I am not despised and shamed. I am known and loved. That's what we need to communicate to people in poverty. Not if you weren't a single mom, if you didn't have sex before you got married, you wouldn't be poor, which is what the church usually has to say to people in poverty, right? The next slide. So the prosperity gospel guises itself in many forms. The goal of the gospel is not to make the poor middle class. In fact, it's to make the middle class poor. But we'll talk about that another day. Poverty is not a character defect or the result of a character defect. Poverty is not the result of bad morals or poor choices. And this has infected the church. So this is what the church generally says to people in poverty. And also, the church has aligned so much with politics that we can't tell the difference between that other slide I just read you and what this slide says, right? So the next one, these are just some quotes from Phineas F. Brzee. Let the Church of the Nazarene be true to its commission, not great and elegant buildings, but to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and wipe away the tears of sorrowing and gather jewels for his diadem. Now remember, this was written in 1908, so the language is a little different. Our church is a missionary church. It knows no difference between home and foreign fields. In these days, all fields are near. This is the thing that's always been puzzling to me. You can always get people, hang on, my phone keeps dinging. It's got to be switched off. Church people love to go on mission trips. And I've become convinced that the reason we love it is because it makes us feel good. Because those people on the other side of the ocean are not going to actually be in your life. They're not going to knock on your door and ask for $20 for gas money. You're not going to have to kind of reevaluate your choices that you make in your life based on having a close friendship with somebody who lives in poverty. And it feels really good. You go over there, and honestly, if you talk to people who are missionaries, they don't really like the short-term mission trip thing. Now, John's mom, she travels to Africa all the time, and she has relationships. This is it's having relationships with people, making a difference. Like, she's there for long periods of time and has relationships with people. So I'm not opposed at all to helping people in other countries. But I am opposed to the idea that we can, and I also know his mom's a hugely compassionate person to people here. But I am opposed to people getting all doughy-eyed about going to feed the hungry kids who are in Uganda and coming back and saying, why don't they get a job? Right? Because somehow we've bought this message that in America we don't have to be poor, because if you work hard here, you can make it. Right? It's the land of opportunity. Well, sometimes it is. Okay, next slide. We were convinced that houses of worship should be plain and cheap to save from financial burdens, that everything should say welcome to the poor. We went in poverty to give ourselves and what God might give us, determined to forego provision for the future and old age in order to see the salvation of God while we were yet there. See, when we started City Church, this wasn't some crazy new idea. This was an old idea, right? Anyway. And that might be, we would be glad to do much more, yet hundreds of dollars have gone to the poor with loving ministry of every kind, and with it a way has been opened to the hearts of men and women that has been unutterable joy. The gospel comes to a multitude without money and without price, and the poorest of the poor are entitled to a front seat at the Church of the Nazarene. And that's one of the reasons I stay here. Let's go to the next slide. I think we might be about done, and that's it. So that's Poverty 101. And I hope you learned something, that you were challenged. And I just thought it was important for us to do this, because as we continue to think about not only working with people at Pleasant Valley, but what other kinds of work might we do, it's important that we have a perspective. I think the right perspective for serving people in poverty is to stand in awe. Instead of coming as, I have something to teach you. You know, I've had people tell me their story, and I've said to them, I don't know how you survive, because I couldn't do that. Like, some people live on about as much money as I spend at Foster. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but seriously, you know, I had somebody tell me, well, our family, we can't make it without all of us having iPhones, and so our monthly bill is like $400 or $500. Well, you can't make it without that? But you think people in poverty should make it without that, right? We're going to listen to a song together now as we begin to move toward receiving this table together. In one of the New Testament letters, Paul writes, "He who was rich became poor, so that out of his poverty we might become rich." Now, I know it's not talking about us becoming financially rich. Obviously, that hasn't happened for most of us. But the point of that verse is that Jesus, who had privilege, we might say, was willing to set that aside to come and wash feet and to feed the hungry and to embrace the broken. And when we follow him, we do the same. And we find in that then there's a richness of life that comes when we engage in that work. So when we come to this table, we are remembering, part of what we're doing is remembering how God has so freely given himself to us and calls us to follow him to do the same. On the night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body given for you. As often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me." And then after supper, he took the cup and he blessed it and said, "This cup is my blood in the new covenant. As often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me." In the Church of the Nazarene, we celebrate open communion, which means that if you want to receive the life of Jesus, be sustained by his life, if you want to give your life away, you're invited to come to this table. You don't have to be a member or have been to a special class. Whether it's your first time here or you've been here 100 times, you're invited to come.
Life and joy and peace.
That is a super old hymn, and it's been a while since I used it, but I really like that. I mean, I think it's written in the 1700s, I saw last night. Well, we have some announcements about ways we're going to serve this week as we continue to seek to become an authentic expression of the way of Jesus in the city of Owosso or wherever you have come here from. And we're going to read together that statement that I read at the beginning today, if you will read with me. We are a multi-generational community of doubters and believers who pray, work, and learn together so that the life of Jesus becomes clearer to us and through us. We seek to understand not what Jesus would do, but what Jesus did. In all that we do, we seek to prioritize those who are often overlooked and excluded. We find every holy excuse, feeding, sheltering, healing, advocating, worshiping, to practice beloved community through genuine relationships. We invite everyone to the table. We believe that Jesus' ministry is fundamentally counterintuitive to culture, and we seek to follow that ministry to bring heaven on earth to as many people as we can. Our Thanksgiving baskets, I think I got a little late start on this year. We are packing baskets next week. However, I'm not here next Sunday, and Stacy's not here next Sunday. And so we need somebody who will be here to take charge of organizing. There's about 15 baskets to pack afterwards. There's a sign-up sheet over there where you can sign up to bring different items. And so they need to be here by next Sunday. But if you're not going to be here Sunday, you can reach out to me, and I'll come meet you at the church, or we'll figure out how to get them there. And the list is going pretty well. Turkeys are on sale at Meijer right now for 49 cents a pound. You get one per transaction. So, go in and out of your car a couple times. It works out to be about $10 per turkey. So it's really a good time to get them. So we have about, I think, 15 families that have signed up. And then I will be back. Whoever does this can just leave the turkeys in the freezer. I'll get them. I'm going to be back Sunday evening, and I will take the turkeys out to Pleasant Valley about 5 o'clock, or the baskets. If anybody wants to go, they're certainly welcome. But I just kind of have a better idea of where the trailers are and how to track people down, so I want to make sure I'm here for that. But anybody who would be willing to kind of just say, I'll have a list. We kind of have two sizes of baskets. Families that have like 5 or more, we give just a little extra to. So I'll have that all laid out if somebody's willing to just coordinate the packing afterwards next week. It doesn't take very long. Yes, yep. The foil pan is the basket, yep. And you put the items in there, yep. I think we also had a grocery bag that accompanied that, because kind of not everything fits into the foil pan. So, but yeah, you'll be here? Okay. All right, that sounds good. Next slide. So we had Poverty 101 today, and then next week we have a presentation from Reach the Forgotten, which is the local jail chaplaincy ministry. And that is going to be, I think, a great presentation as well. Next slide. This week, this is what's going on. Pretty much the usual. Let's go to the next slide. And we are going to be hosting a baby shower here for Kyle, Steck, and Renee. It's actually Tiffany. I thought I changed this. Tiffany Renee, but she sometimes goes by Renee and sometimes Tiffany. And I thought her name was Renee. Anyway, they come to our Tuesday night dinners every week, and they're expecting a little baby boy. And if you know Kyle, you know how appropriate this theme is. Oh dear, a little buck is almost here. So we're going to do the shower here on January 6th. And for the most part, they're going to handle the food, and we're going to handle decorations, and you're invited to come. We try to be supportive to our families and just show them a lot of love. So that's coming up, and I just wanted to get it out there now because the holidays are coming, and all of our brains are going to be going to white noise here shortly. So I just wanted to get this on the radar. And does anybody have anything to share for This Is Good? It's Ted's birthday. Yes. Tomorrow's your dad's birthday. Okay. Some of you know our little friend Jasmine out at the trailer park. Today's her birthday, too. So we're taking her out to birthday dinner tonight. Yeah, Ted and I. She's 12 today. So, yep. Anybody else have anything to share? Yeah.
We got to see our boy Dylan yesterday.
We did. Yes, we did. We got a 2-hour visit with Dylan. Oh, guys.
His spirits are good.
Yep. Yep. It's pretty optimistic. I have to say that I cried walking out, not so much because of Dylan, but because I just didn't know what to expect. I've never visited a prison before. And as we're sitting in the waiting room and all these little kids are waiting to go visit, and this one little girl's about 9 or 10, and her grandpa gives her some money, and she knows, like, to go over and how to buy the photo tag, and, like, that's her life. I said to Ted as we were walking out, I said, she's going to go to school on Monday, and nobody's going to know what she did this weekend. Whew, it was... The visit was great, but little moms have to change babies' diapers before you go in. They're like, no matter how long, even if you just got there, there's a diaper changing spot, and you got to change the baby's diaper, so you can't smuggle things in diapers. It's just, yeah, lots of things. I hadn't experienced that before. Let's pray together for our offering. If you have money to give, the joy bucket's back there, or you can give online. Oh God, creator of everything, it is a joy and a blessing to share our gifts with one another. As we offer these things for the work of your church, help us to be mindful of all that we can do together as the body of Christ. Amen. And let's stand together now to receive what is a long benediction, but it's one of my favorites. It's a Franciscan prayer. No, this is not. It's Franciscan. I was experimenting with ChatGPT last night, and I asked him to give me a benediction about a service themed in poverty, and it did, but I didn't like it that much, so I got this one. May God bless us with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that we may live from deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of God's creation, so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless us with just enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in the world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all children and our neighbors who are poor. Amen. Go in God's